All right. This is Davi. Sorry. Davi. Sorry. He's going to talk about the hidden hot battle lessons of the Cold War. Just some quick notes. This whole thing's being streamed, and we want to be courteous to everyone, so please keep your cell phones off. Our exit is out the back there. I'm not sure we're going to have time for questions. He's got a lot of slides to do, and he's going to work through them. So if we make it to question and answer time, I'll be walking around with this wireless microphone, and I'm trying to get you guys to ask your questions on here. This is so the people on the streaming end can hear them. And then if we don't have enough time for questions, I'm going to have to ask everyone to move out to the back, out the door, so that way we can get the next talk in. So we'll have to see how the talk goes, and we'll get there from there. I need to thank our sponsors real quick. Especially our stellar sponsors. We have Versprite, Protivity, Tenable, Amazon, and Source of Knowledge. It's through their support and support of all the volunteers you see and all the shirts and all the staff that makes this event happen, and it couldn't happen without them. And so with that, I'll let you get started. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. I do have a lot of slides. People ask me how long this talk will be, and I can't tell you because I never give my talks twice usually. I shouldn't say never. I do sometimes. But generally, they're fresh and new. This is one of the hardest talks I put together because it's about African history, and I know a lot of people don't care about African history. So I'm going to try to make it fit into a context of information security. Just to start off, for example, the story is about a hidden hot battle in the Cold War. Anyone know what I'm talking about there? The battles in Africa that happened during the Cold War? Wars? No? Anybody recognize this graphic? Know what we're representing here? Notice anything strange about it? It represents the number of deaths by country. So up here you see this 26,000 deaths. This is like for a battle. There's 4,000 or 5,000 deaths. See this 0? Notice anything strange about the sort of barrier of no deaths here? Down here there's quite a few, 7,000 deaths. Anybody know what that represents? Okay, good. So this talk is about analysis of data and how important it is. The abstract, I hope, sort of put it together that by relying on knowledge systems or relying on learning systems for knowledge, maybe a better way to say it, we take a lot of risk. And so if we take a map like that and I tell you what it means, you just have to trust me. But I'm using an algorithm that you may not have any transparency into. So you don't know why you should trust me or not. And so this is creating, for me, a sort of ethical crisis in this world. My background is actually in history. So bringing it full circle, we talk more and more about humans and the human role in information security. That's where I started. I started in philosophy and political science of combat, the ethics of intervention. And so really what I'm doing now is trying to figure out how to get integrity into large warehouses of data, which was the same thing I did as a historian. So I ran a company for a long time called Flying Penguin. Now I'm working with MongoDB, which is a huge data repository, trying to find ways to get integrity into databases. This is really a general high-level talk, and I'm really a fan of that, even though people like Dan Geer say it won't exist anymore. I think he's flat wrong, and I'd be happy to explain that later, but hopefully the talk speaks for itself also. He says specialization. He talks about insects. He says people are going to have ever likely for people to have the big picture, and I'm going to show you a big picture today, and I hope you are encouraged to do more big picture work. Just generally speaking, how that works. If we have shared experiences, we can have local generalizations, tribal, if you will. But to be able to abstract and pull back and have a general picture is actually what humans are supposed to do. That makes us able to do synthesis and analysis. And that's what we're asking learning systems to do. So to say that humans aren't going to do it, I think is fallacious in a couple of ways. One is that you're trusting systems to do that, which they aren't very good at. And two is that's what humans are really good at in the first place. So if you stop doing it, it's kind of like stopping exercise. You might get really unhealthy. So also it's about history, as I've already talked about. The KGB, for example, says if you forget history, you're doomed to repeat it. I think this is kind of cool because everybody likes talking about the KGB as like the smart guys, and there's a lot of citations I see in information security about the KGB said this and that. And ultimately, in my opinion, having done research over the Cold War, my master's degree is in this, I find that the KGB just copied people a lot. They actually don't know that much. And so here you have Joyce Santayana saying the same thing in 1906, and there's no citation from the KGB about smart people who said it before. They just tend to take credit and move on. So my talk also is about ethics and how you should provide citations. I provide a lot in my talks, and then also how we should think about the sort of decisions and things that we hear. So when people give us knowledge, are they coming from an ethical or a moral standpoint? That's really the kicker to this whole talk. So let's go to the general state of cyber flaws to sort of set the stage of what I'm talking about. There are three things that we always tend to put things into, the triad of CIA. There's no pun intended there. It's really confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And lately I've seen people talking about these in terms of espionage, subversion, and sabotage. So we're transitioning into the physical world, the human world. I think that's pretty cool. So we can talk about cyber war now and cyber's making the crossover into everyone's lives. When I talk about confidentiality, I can pretty much tell you that we've solved most of the hard problems. I had this talk with Bruce Schneier once, and he pointed out to me that he's working in psychology. That's not my background, but he's getting into it, and he's moving into history because that's really where the hard stuff is, the people problems. He said the mathematics aren't that difficult anymore. And so I kind of shared this view. In 2007, I helped release the EKMI. We wrote this standard for key management. In 2009, these guys came along, and they sort of copied it, but they made a better version, so I wasn't too bummed about it. These big companies came in and stomped on our standard. But I was cool with it because we now have KMIP today and we're using it a lot. KMIP is awesome because it allows you to do key exchange, to do confidentiality at massive scale. And so what that means is through 2008, we had these crazy models. This is Microsoft saying, don't use encryption, it's really slow and it's really complicated. And then today we're talking about doing cell-level encryption, and it's probably going to work. So by next year, I hope to have some real models, working models that are actually going to make people's data safe at a tiny granular level. I think that's pretty cool. So our confidentiality story is pretty tight when we talk about security at massive, massive scale, global. But when we talk about availability, it's even better, and that's crazy. I worked in availability for a long time, disaster recovery, business continuity, and so in 2014, I was working at EMC, and we were launching systems in 10 hours. 40,000 systems or so we could launch in 10 hours, replacing entire data centers. We could move your entire company 200 kilometers, and you wouldn't even notice it. So availability was pretty much killing it. We got so bold that we actually, this wasn't my idea, but we said we'd give you $1 million if you could find any downtime. So that's pretty crazy. The first customer to demonstrate any outages would get $1 million. Of course, we never say dollars, so I always joke that we would give you a bunch of bucks, but that was my sense of humor. So also, I think this has gotten even better. In January of this year, there was a really cool document about people are doing 100% uptime now. We talked about 9s in the past, but these guys are actually able to achieve 100%, and that means that they're reducing the number of herd loss by hundreds per month. They're launching about 50,000 instances a month, and so availability is a tight story. So confidentiality and availability, I'm like, wow, let me talk to you about all the great solutions we have. The market is just roaring forward. There's a lot of economics involved, but it's pretty cool what we're doing. So let's get to the heart of the matter, which is the integrity issue. All right, and so we have controls in the other two, but we don't have controls here. Anybody want to guess why that is? Why is integrity behind the laggard of the three? It's hard. They're all hard. But I mean, it's not that it's hard. It's the economics of it. It's really the market of it. Like, what was the benefit of having better integrity, better knowledge? But where was the risk of having bad knowledge? I get peppered with this question because, for example, I was in South Africa with the police force there, and they were saying, look, if you can have a really high availability, our Oracle databases are up 100%, and we can keep them totally safe, that's great. But if someone makes a bad error and you propagate it through the entire police system and people get arrested and put in jail or killed because you made an error in the integrity of the data, what are you going to do about it? And I was like, I don't really have a good answer for you. I don't have a way to measure. That sounds like something a scientist would do. But that's not what information security does. I can give you a checksum, but that assumes that there's something right in the first place. I was just like, what? So I've been working on this problem for a long time, and it's getting worse and worse. Here's an example I saw the other day, is that, here's an app that'll tell you what to eat. Poisonous mushroom or not poisonous mushroom. I mean, this is kind of a joke, but it's kind of real. It's like a book. The book you assume got published because someone vetted it, but the app, anyone can publish an app tomorrow that says eat this fly agaric, and what are you going to do about it? So it's kind of a snafu, which is an old saying from the military, but they're saying it's the most deadly app I've ever seen. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it doesn't make the humorous point that we're running into this head first, and people aren't thinking about it enough. So the deadly risks that I'm going to talk about today come from this idea that you can't tell what's real and what's false. And so in this case, this is from Splunk. You grab a bunch of data, you throw it into these visualizations. We're doing a little bit of this in security. You can say, for example, it's too hot or it's too low pressure, but do you trust that data that you're pulling in? Why would you? Let me make it more of a point here. If you get to that visualization, you're essentially getting to a point of subversion, because if this was a political process, you'd be saying when things are too hot, people are distracted. I can heat you up, I can give you lots of data that makes you really angry, and now you're going to be unable to respond to what I'm working on, right? This is like classic subversion methods. People use it for intelligence gathering, and they use all kinds of psychological operations. Or maybe I can disable you by lowering your pressure so much that you can't get people to rise up because they don't think there's a problem here. So by screwing with the data and the message, I'm changing the ultimate outcome or the situation that we're in, and we don't know what's going on. And these are basically conditions that I can create by understanding what to do with the data. So integrity of data can be actually pretty powerful. You don't react to something that's going to kill you. In effect, what we're really doing is training systems to harm. And that's really the scary point. This is Gina Davis talking about how men in a room, when they look around, if they see 17% of the room as women, they think it's 50%. Now, they learned that at some point in their lives. And in my talk last year, I talked about all the racist examples we're seeing. And so I think this is getting more and more into people's face where they start to see, like, well, if you start learning from an early age that something is true when it's not, you essentially are being trained, learn in a way that you're going to do damage later. And so machines are going to do this faster. Humans already do this. We have lots of evidence of bias and race being an issue, sexism. But when you turn a machine on, you're going to be doing that in liquid time. Right? Super fast. Just like the book would take a while to publish to tell you to eat the wrong mushroom and be held liable probably, an app can be published and you can eat the wrong mushroom like tomorrow. So, and she literally says what we're in effect doing is training children. I would just transpose this to what we're in effect doing is training systems, right? So here's another example. This guy's saying we're manipulating the software in people's head, essentially. So he's saying jihadists come from manipulating the data that people see. So it's a really good analysis. This guy is spot on. But what he's saying is that if you write poems in a certain way, you can pull threads and you can give people a message and they act upon those messages. So we're talking about who controls truth now. We're talking about integrity and data really being the future. And the CIA has already flagged this. So this was said recently by an acting director, an ex-acting director, who said intelligence becomes a weapon. Now, I know there's controversy around calling cyber weapons weapons, but I'm on the side of saying it's legit. Like, I really think we should start calling them weapons. I don't have a problem with it. And it's not because I really think there's a great case for why they actually are weapons, but every argument I've heard so far to say they're not weapons, they're not physical, has been terrible. So until people come up with a better argument for why they're not weapons, I'm sort of staying on the side of they actually are weapons. They do damage, they can do harm. So here's an example, just to jump into Africa a little bit, just to give you a taste. One of the things I ran into years ago was people asked me to buy into a malaria solution. They asked me to donate a lot of money, lots of money, into a foundation that was going to solve malaria. And I started tweeting out, well, I don't see how this is going to work because you're donating hundreds of thousands of nets to areas that don't have malaria, but you're not donating hundreds of thousands of nets to areas that do have malaria. Look at Sierra Leone, for example. This quick map you can see over here shows you where Sierra Leone is, Liberia, Ivory Coast. Anybody know what these countries share in common? What's unique about them and why they have that weird band of malaria? They have a history of war, and they have a history of supply chain deficiencies. So in a war-torn country, it's very difficult to get anything to the people who need it because of this destabilization. There's a ton of corruption, and there's a lot of black market activity. Sierra Leone in particular. They had like 100% loss of nets that went to Sierra Leone. So the foundation that was giving out nets said, why would we give nets if 100% of them are lost? So we'll just stop giving nets, and we'll just give them to places where we have pretty good penetration. So I looked at the data, and immediately I said, you're giving them to the wrong countries, and they said, shh, don't say that. It's going to cause a political problem for us if you start identifying political actors who are causing problems for us. So I got their perspective, but what I didn't understand is why we're not talking about the data integrity problem. And I started digging into it, and I found things like the drugs we're giving people, 35% of them are not good drugs. The supply chain upstream is actually putting fake drugs in. So the nets aren't working, the drugs aren't working, and no one's really talking about this issue in a way that we'd be fixing it. I suggested fixes. I said, I'll put RFID tags on, I'll send drones out, we'll track all the... And they were like, no, you don't understand. It's a big economic, huge, wicked problem. Anybody know why this got fixed, or at least is better now? What's that?
Bill Gates?
Bill Gates? No. Bill's probably, he's the opposite. He's part of the problem. He's pushing solutions that are very surveillance-oriented and that aren't focused on supply chain. He doesn't understand the human aspect of the problem at all. It got fixed by Ebola. Ebola is a different risk model. So if you don't take the drugs or you don't do the fix, people die, and it's super contagious. Should I keep going? Okay. All right, I'm going to keep going. I hope the strobe doesn't bother you. As I was saying, Ebola really fixed this because it forced the issue to a higher level of death, right? So you die if you don't fix it, which malaria isn't really that big of a problem for most people. It kills the elderly and it kills the young, but it doesn't really kill sort of the wide swath of, and doesn't kill as quickly, obviously. It's much harder. So Ebola pushed the issue. The United Nations rolled in, basically, literally rolled in. Oh boy. All right, so they literally rolled in tents and supply chains, and they managed everything to a tight shipped. So that's basically what fixed it, is their supply chain. And if you look at it historically in the 1600s, 1700s, that's how it was fixed in the past. We basically got a really good view of how to get everyone the medicine they needed. That's not what was happening here because of the conflict and the fraud, like I mentioned. But this also opened my eyes to like how important it is to understand the situation in a country like Liberia. Here's another example where automated attacks in Al Jazeera, some people did some quick analysis and they found 71% of the discussion was generated by bots. And so they saw like 2,000, 2,400 bots were created in just, 1 year. In just a couple months, actually, they're generating huge amounts of bots. So the conversations we're hearing are maybe fake news, like the fire alarms may be bogus. And so all around the world, this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and information security does not seem prepared for it. I haven't seen a lot of people that are saying, I have a solution for this that we can fix. Facebook has talked about real names, but it's not really a fix that I would, just like Gates, I don't really think they have the mind in the right mindset. So it's really about harm from insecure learning models. That's what we're talking about. Like Gina Davis said it so well. We're talking about data integrity attacks. And last year I gave a lot of examples of how you can attack things, and I gave Tesla examples, I gave Nightscope examples, and they still have flaws. We tested a Tesla just a couple months ago and was totally broken. So here's an example I thought was interesting because Miyazaki, if you know him, he's an animator who creates basically cartoons. And so he's presented an artificial intelligence, a machine learning version of a cartoon, which is that this thing is going to walk. But it's been trained on harm, if you can imagine. It's been trained like a zombie might be trained to walk like it's disabled. So he watches, you should watch this video. So he watches this thing and it moves around and he says, I feel like this is an insult to life. He says, this is bad. What you're training it on is a terrible thing for humanity. And I think he's right. I think he gets it. It's an insult to life itself. And that's what we're talking about for the future of AI, is that if we don't get this right as information security professionals, we're allowing harm to be done. It would be like giving people weak crypto. It would be like giving people systems that could fail, fall over, and not have availability. So we've done this for a long, long time. It's not like it's brand new. I mean, if we look at Pearl Harbor, they saw the planes coming on the radar scope. They mapped, I actually took this picture myself in Pearl Harbor. This is the track of the planes coming to Pearl Harbor. Do you know why they didn't do anything about it? They didn't believe radar was really a tool. They thought it was a toy. They didn't believe this stuff. They had other information coming in that maybe there was a B-17 flying from somewhere. It might be that instead. And so they dismissed all of the intelligence coming in, right? So they had advance warning. They had 3 days warning, and they had the radar scope. But they dismissed it with this technology. In 1986, NASA spent a ton of time and money to sort of do the opposite. They put all their scientists in a plane, and they flew them around, and they said, we're going to fix the problem with weather. There were 500 fatalities over a certain period of time, and so they put all these sensors on planes, and from that point on, basically from the 90s, Doppler radar in the nose cone and all this stuff solved the problem of downdrafts killing people. Planes were crashing and killing everybody on board. So that's pretty awesome. That's sort of what you see today in a Tesla. They talk about the same technology. So we're sort of in the precipice of doing the same thing. Very different, though, because NASA is much more about science and saving lives. Tesla is about profits. So in 2017, we're reaching a whole nother level. This is what the future of planes are going to be like. They're going to be mesh skins that are constantly taking in data and have to interpret risk all the time. I did this graphic. I think it's kind of funny. But it's basically, it's going to be computers in the sky, and we're going to have to use integrity to manage safety. And a lot of people can die if we screw it up. And we're talking 800 terabytes per flight today. I had to deal with this for years about how much data we generate in a flight and what to do about the integrity. So last year, like I said, I talked about Nightscope. I talked about how this thing can't see and falls over and runs over people and it's dangerous. And then you might have seen this year, it fell in love with an apparition of itself and killed itself at its feet. I really think it was love that was driving it. But Tesla, same thing. I told them, like, look, we can fake data. Your sensors are bad. You killed Joshua Brown. And then this year, this guy's driving, and it mistook that sign, which has an outline that tells it it's a highway sign, for a speed sign. That is so bad on so many levels. That's like SQL injection to the max. It's like wide open, send in data, completely wrong output. It thinks it's 105 miles an hour when it sees a road sign for 101 being the number of the road. That's like human blindness. You can't even be a driver if you can't see. You can't be a driver if you can't interpret the sign shape. There's just so many things it fails on. And this just happened the other day. This is very dangerous. This is going to kill somebody. And like I said, we tested a Tesla ourselves, and we were able to make it do bad things. They don't talk to me. They don't seem that interested. I do meet them sort of off the record, but it hasn't really formalized. And I do think they're a very dangerous company for these reasons. Let me put a finer point on it. The report that I saw that came out, everybody said Joshua Brown ignored 6 or 7 warnings. That is not the report I read, because what I read said 3 things. It said I've sort of ordered them here. This is the order that they were written. I reordered them. It said, autopilot requires continual and full attention of a driver. Does that sound like autopilot to you? It said that the reality is drivers don't follow instructions and manufacturers have the responsibility. And it said, third, that the system has been updated to reinforce the need for better driver engagement. So they changed the system. That is not the driver ignored 6 or 7 things. That is, we screwed up, we had to change our system. Let me put it like this. Manufacturers are responsible. The system had to be updated. And this guy, who was a Navy SEAL, who understood risk, he was an explosives expert. He was an electronics expert. You think this guy ignores 6 or 7 warnings just because? Ignores intelligence telling him he's going to die just because? Oh, fun? No, this guy knows what he's doing. And so when he dies, I think the bar has to be raised. So let's look back to see further ahead. And I only have 10 minutes, so this is going to be kind of fun. Nixon essentially was a white supremacist. I hate to say it that way, but that's true. So the end of World War II said, hey, everyone's going to be liberated from colonialism. That's just kind of the way the world was going. And white supremacy had lost its appeal. The Nazis had been defeated. So now is a time for the blacks to rise up in Africa and form their own government, and that's what started to happen. But Kissinger looked at this and said, no, that's not what needs to happen. He said Wilson was wrong, Truman was wrong, Eisenhower was wrong. The world wars did not teach us that there should be a liberal standard for the world, that we should be free and people should have self-independence. He said instead we need a fight, and we need this sort of elitist, amoral exercise in keeping the bad guys down, and we decide who the bad guys are. So he rejects Johnson's racial justice. He labels those who oppose him as anti-white, and he says to the State Department, you don't know what you're talking about. I dispute the integrity of the data. And this is the key where I try to tie it together. So in 1975, the experts in the Foreign Service said, there is an internal struggle, an election, if you will, although it may be violent, between 3 factions. And these 3 factions don't really affect us. I mean, there's some oil and there's some coffee, but Angola is basically off the radar for us. So why don't we just let them form their government? They also say there's some regional dynamics. It looks like most of the people in the area are anti-Soviet. They really don't like the Soviet Union. They don't want the Soviet Union. They say they're worried about trade. They're worried about the railroad being safe and working. They don't want people taking it over. They don't want wars or conflict. So they're anti-conflict and they're anti-Soviet. Mobutu in particular was so paranoid, he thought that when his economy was failing, it might be the CIA trying to overthrow him. So they're worried about stability. What they really need is stability in the region. And he's looking at China for aid because they're giving him essentially non-militarized aid. They're building a railroad. So in that context, the Foreign Service is saying, look at this, what do you think, the data is coming in, what do you think Kissinger says? Kissinger says, you're a bunch of bleeding hearts. You guys like blacks too much. So he closes the model, he creates cognitive blindness, and he says he wants a post-Vietnam conflict with the Soviet Union that no one can see, because it'll be judged for being amoral. So he creates this secret no-win war in the South. And he basically takes $14 million, because he's told that $100 million, the CIA says you need $100 million to win and create a stable environment that will be a beautiful future country. And he says, well, let's just put $14 million in there and mess with them a bunch so that we create a quagmire that they fall into. So he selects out of 5 options the white minority communication option, which means get South Africa to constantly sort of needle people with white supremacy. So there you get 27 years of civil war. 1975 to 2002 was civil war that was created by the United States because we wanted to keep white supremacy going as long as possible. And we called that the fight against the Soviet Union. But it didn't make sense because the actual data at the time told us that they didn't like the Soviet Union. So it drove them to the Soviet Union. Because as we brought in the white supremacists to fight with them, they brought in Cuba and the Soviet Union to defend themselves. And so essentially what happened is, by 1987, there was a hot battle in the middle of the Cold War that most people don't even know about or care about. In the United States, for sure. But basically what happened was Cuba was airlifting massive reinforcements, South Africa's sending all these white troops in to invade, and they meet in this hot battle where the Cubans win. And part of that's because of sanctions against South Africa. They had had sanctions for over 10 years at this point, and so they were fighting at sort of a technological disadvantage. But it's also because you're talking about a country that's trying to gain independence, and they're still trying to basically build up the sort of stability they wanted so they could be prosperous. So that was the turning point for apartheid. After that, apartheid started to wither away. The South Africans gave up, essentially, and so you can even find reference to this where Nelson Mandela says, thank you to those people who died so that we could have a shift away from apartheid. So Nixon essentially perpetuated this white supremacy movement all the way through this hot battle, and it was all based on this ability to turn off the news and turn off the integrity of the data that was coming into him. and make the wrong decision. Now, this is a long time stretched out, but this is what you study when you study international relations and history. You try to find out what really happened in history so that you don't make the same mistakes. And in computers, if we let artificial intelligence or if you let machine learning systems take this data and they speed up that process, it's 500,000 people that died. That's a lot of people to die on a simple mistake. And for what? They could have been liberated early, and they could have been stabilized early, and things would have been better. I can give you examples all around the world, but I like this one because no one talks about it, and it was one of the biggest battles in the Cold War. Ethiopia is another one, which is actually what I got my degree on. So if we look ahead, we see these risks all over the map. I see them when talking about environmentalism. I see them when we talk about education, criminalization of drugs, alcohol, pot, healthcare policy, election tallies. Just the other day, I turned on my phone and it said that it's 0 degrees in San Francisco. And I thought, who's messing with the data on the environment? How are you going to have an intelligent, informed debate around the risks to the planet if you're not even able to tell the weather without throwing zeros here and there? And of course, we know that the machines in the United States are super old. So does anyone trust an election machine that hasn't been updated for at least 10 years? That's crazy. It's crazy to me that the CSO of Diebold doesn't talk about integrity of machines. That just makes no sense to me. How can that person be the CSO, be a security expert, be testifying to Congress in an election company, Diebold voting machines, and not talk about the integrity of those voting machines? That to me is a huge failing of our industry. But I think that's where we're going now, is we're trying to figure out now. We've got confidentiality. We know the encryption debate is out there. Everyone's talking about it. We've got availability. Everyone talks about 9/11 and the outages and so forth. But we need to step into these bigger shoes and really start to figure out, what is healthcare supposed to do? What is national security in terms of people that are ill? So, unfortunately, I see already the Realist amoral cyber platform emerging. Just the other day, I saw this guy, Thomas Bossart, give a talk where he said the same thing as Nixon. And he started talking about cyber war in terms of multilateral being bad, which is essentially what Truman, Eisenhower, Wilson were trying to say. The lesson of the world wars is that we need United Nations, a League of Nations. We need a way to figure out morality so that we can build our systems. And I'm talking about war systems. I'm talking about peace systems. All technology has to be built with a moral compass, is what they were telling us. But Kissinger came in and said, no, we don't need that. We need to fight each other and we need to decide for ourselves who's right and who's wrong. If that sounds familiar, it's because Bossart's saying the same thing today. And we're likely to get in a cyber war with people like this who are doing the same thing that Kissinger did. And that's going to be really bad. There's going to be a lot of lives lost. There's going to be people dying from healthcare. There's going to be people dying from environmentalism. There's going to be people dying from education. And it's because they're trying to do this. They don't like calling it realpolitik because it sounds German, but this sort of realist platform. So integrity is huge. I think it's super important. And I really find that we're entering into the same problems that we've seen before. And I hope people can learn from history that the way to fix it is to build a compliance platform and to build a morality platform. The difference between security and compliance, I always tell people, is security is you judge yourself, compliance is someone else judges you. That's it. So if you want to do compliance, you're working towards a shared view of what's good. If you want to do security, you just pat yourself on the back all the time. So that's it. I'll take questions after the talk, and thanks for the interruptions and working through them.
We're going to give them 5 minutes for questions if anybody has any.
Who? Since we have the... Okay. I'll take that. Any questions?
I was going to hold the 10-minute sign back up again, but then you would just gotten confused. Put in bad data. So
okay.
Any questions for anyone?
Yeah.
So in 1984, can you speak in the microphone?
Okay. Is this working? Good.
Yeah.
So in 1984, the book, right? If you remember, the hero's job as part of the, evil government is going through newspaper files and destroying information, destroying newspaper reports that are inconvenient to the truth that they were pushing. And I think today what is happening is basically people are just ignoring what was in the history file.
Thank you.
Sorry, Davi, you were at our own grade.
Oh, thank you.
that it's not so much that they're faking the data, but that they found out ways to get people just to ignore it completely. I wonder how that fits.
Yeah, this is a huge topic. So I just saw 1984, the play, and there was a scene in it where they show the screen of all this data. This is in New York City. They have a play on Broadway, and it's erasing the data. And the guy's going through and doing exactly that. And I was thinking, that's amazing. That's what I'm doing with confidentiality tools. GDPR right now says make the right to erasure. So like all things in security, it's a balance, right? There's two edges to the sword. So on the one hand, I'm like, that's great. I can erase somebody who wants to disappear. But on the other hand, I've learned from the past, a lot of years of studying this, that it's better to create data if you want to hide than it is to erase data. They actually advise spies, if you want to create a proper persona, you have to generate a certain amount of noise so people believe you're real. If you have a super clean profile, no one believes it's real. So this is a very difficult problem in integrity. I think it's easy to write about in fictional terms because you can just say, you know, this person suffered because they disappeared. But on the other hand, that's what a lot of people want in reality, is they want to be able to be left alone. They want to control and curate their own message. And so I don't know if I have answers, but I know that I'm doing both. I'm giving people the ability to disappear. I'm working on that right now. If I get the cell level encryption right, that's when I pull the key, their data is gone forever. But I'm also going to be able to make sure that I have accurate data on people and we keep a long enough stream on them so when somebody says they're X, I can say, no, the evidence shows they're Y. So control of data is very difficult. And in history, of course, the more records we find, the better picture we think we find, as long as the information isn't swayed highly. A good example of this is Bletchley Park. I'm so sick of Enigma stuff. It's like every time somebody brings up the Enigma, they say, commemorate the Enigma. I say, do you know the United States also had encryption and had better encryption and it worked and was never broken, the ROC-X system? Why do we talk about the Enigma so much? Well, it's because after the Second World War, all of this was secret. But there was this guy in the British RAF who decided he'd write a book about how amazing the British were. This is typical of British historians. And so he said, we cracked Enigma and we're awesome. And that created this whole lore of Enigma. So a little bit of information can cause a big rift. And because the other information was essentially deleted, nobody knows about ROC-X, nobody knows what happened because that was not supposed to come out, we don't really have a picture of how awesome that was relative to this. So we get into these situations where we have to have the right information and then we have to put it into context while also protecting people's privacy. When I talk about the Polish cracking Enigma in the 20s and 30s, it shocks people when I talk about, but that was only recently revealed. The Polish have only recently been given credit for cracking it early. And the reason that they cracked it early, not to bore everybody with history, but...
Not true. The Polish we've known about that for ages, you just haven't paid attention.
Well, that's a good point. So it was there, a lot of it was there, but they weren't as self-promoting. Rajewski and those guys never came out like the RAF and said, we did this. But more to the point, the Polish were worried about Germany in the 30s, and so they cracked it. The British weren't worried about the Germans. They were worried about Spain and Italy because the fascists, Spanish Civil War, and then Italy invaded North Africa. So the British only really started looking at the German Enigma after they declared war on Germany. And so when you really look at the politics, it has a lot to do with why we know certain things and why they came out in a certain way. But to answer your question, we have to do both. We have to delete and we also have to expand our knowledge at the same time. It's a conflict. It's a balance.
So we're going to have to stop the questions. He's going to have to go out to the back and take more questions. We got the next speaker in.
Or sense of writing.
Say again?
Or sense of writing.
Understand. All right. Okay, so thank you guys for paying attention to the talk. Appreciate it. We're going to reset the next talk.